We can go ahead and get started with introductions because that'll take a couple of minutes before moving into the content of the talk. Hi, everybody. For those of you on the line that may not have seen my face before, my name is Jessica Cross. I'm a research oceanographer at the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory based in Seattle, Washington. And I was one of the co-chairs for a workshop on measurement, verification, and reporting of carbon dioxide removal methods in the marine sector that was held in September of last year. I was joined as co-chair of that meeting by a variety of others, including folks that I hope will hop on the line and introduce themselves now. Pat.
Hi, I'm Patrick Rafter. I'm an assistant researcher at UC Irvine.
Jaime.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jaime Palter. I'm an associate professor at the University of Rhode Island.
Clare.
Hi, I'm Clare Reimers. I'm a distinguished professor at Oregon State University.
Matt, are you on the line with us today? Not hearing from Matt Long, who joins us from NCAR. I believe also we are missing Lennart Bach, who is a researcher at the University of Tasmania. So shout out to Lennart for showing up for so many very early meetings, even if necessarily he doesn't want to join from the middle of the night for this one. We also were supported in this workshop by the OCB Project Office, which includes Heather.
Hi, everyone. My name's Heather Benway. I'm an oceanographer and senior research specialist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and the executive officer of the OCB Project Office.
As well as May.
Hey, everyone. I'm May Maheigan. I work with Heather and do community engagement and communications for the Project Office.
Anybody else from the Project Office on the line that may want to introduce themselves? Okay, hearing none, I guess we will go ahead and get started. So as stated, we held this workshop in late September. I know that many of you on the line were in attendance, but perhaps many of you on the line were not. And so we're going to handle this webinar kind of in two ways today. We're going to offer a summary kind of some of the educational points that we talked about. We're also going to try to capture some of the evolution in our thinking since then, and then as well talk about some of the outcomes for the workshop, the messages that you shared with us during the breakout groups, and how we plan to move forward sponsoring a working group, again, through the OCB Project Office. We're grateful for the support in this process from NSF and NASA, as well as the many different groups that contributed to planning and that we consulted during the planning of this workshop. I don't have time to list all of them, but know that this was a real community effort and we're so grateful to have had your input. Okay, so we really started out with this workshop by not necessarily describing the necessity for CDR. We hoped that folks brought that as part of their expertise, but by talking about MRV and how challenging it is to necessarily quantify and verify carbon removal from some of these projects. And a good synopsis of kind of the state of play of the industry right now is shown here in this bar chart on the left that simply indicates that offsets don't actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You can see that carbon removal technologies is a 0 at the bottom of this bar chart. Perhaps that is changing. On January 13th, Climeworks announced that they had third-party verification of the carbon that they have removed through a direct air capture project from the atmosphere. Obviously, that's not necessarily the same as third-party verification of removal through a marine CDR method, which was the focus of our workshop, but does emphasize that the community is moving forward. Accordingly, one of the ways that we're trying to introduce some accountability into this industry right now and build integrity is by trying to develop these quantification and verification methods. And that's not just the science end, that's also the policy end. And there are certainly accountability groups out there like the Integrity Council, like Carbon 180, like Carbon Plan, that are really trying to contribute to the development of these ideas across the sector. But why do we think OCB needs to be involved? you know, if we have all of these accountability groups, what's really our role? The truth is that commercial investment community is coming to us because we have the expertise that is necessary to actually make those judgments, right? There is science that's needed to inform measurement, reporting, and verification processes. That includes measuring things like efficiency, and efficacy. Does it actually work? And if so, how efficiently? And then, you know, how long do those things work? And those are informed by questions about leakage. Does the carbon come back out after you've removed it from the atmosphere, as well as thinking about environmental impacts? Because MRV is itself an accountability process, the truth is that you know, we're holding some of these ideas of accountability and principles of justice in assumption by just trying to inject, you know, accountability into the process. And so thinking about how environmental justice factors into regulations and decision making and how the data products that we as a science community create can support those efforts is also really important. Last, we're the ones that are developing the infrastructure, not just the expertise to be able to assess CDR methods overall. So we really believe the OCB community has an interest in this conversation. Not only is the private sector coming to us, but we also have our own scientific motivations for getting involved. And those are really the two main reasons of why we hosted this workshop. So we didn't necessarily intend for this workshop to be decisional. There is no cookbook for MRV, and we didn't want to indicate that there was. We're not going to create one in 4 days at a workshop conference, right? This is going to be an ongoing conversation across the industry and scientific communities and nonprofit organizations that are trying to hold both of us accountable. So really the purpose of this workshop was to inform our community about what some of the issues are, highlight the major open questions that may underpin proposals that we would submit in the future, and then try to build networks to help answer those questions. We want you to understand the lay of the land, know what it is that you need there, that you might be able to do going forward, and have the necessary support to actually go out and do those things. Accordingly, you can't do everything at a workshop. And so there were a couple of things that we avoided doing. So you won't see a summary in this talk of why CDR is necessary. We just treated that as an assumption from the very beginning. We also didn't talk about offsets. Offsets are an important part of this conversation. Many MRV practices will relate both to offsets as well as to thinking about removal, but we didn't really talk about any of the issues inherent in offsetting versus removing carbon from the atmosphere. We also didn't view our role as triaging CDR methods, as saying this one is better than that one, or setting a priority for which one should go first. That too is going to be an ongoing conversation with the rest of the scientific community. So if that's why you're here, because you're hoping for some of those answers and definitive statements, unfortunately, you're not going to hear me make them on behalf of our steering committee or on behalf of our workshop attendees. Claire, I wanted to offer you the opportunity to take this next part of the presentation since you wrote these slides.
Okay, well, I wasn't expecting that, but yeah, so I put these slides together for a summary back at my institution. And so just to help everyone have a common understanding of what we mean by MRV, or measurement, reporting, and verification. There's a definition here. And again, it refers to a multi-step process to measure the amount of greenhouse gas emissions removed by a method or activity and over a period of time. And then report that to a third party who verifies the carbon offsets. And so, again, there are a number of issues associated with the approaches to marine carbon dioxide removal. So we tried to, and these came up in most of our sessions at the workshop. But just again, to get everyone on the same page. So one of the challenges is this concept of additionality, which the diagram here shows it in a simplified form. and it's basically a change from a baseline. Of course, one of the big issues for marine CDR is measuring even the baseline and the variability in a baseline. So again, the challenge being, can we differentiate an intervention activity result from a baseline and show that there was an uptake that wouldn't have happened anyway. Next slide. Permanence is another issue. So there are a lot of methods that promise to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for the short term, but if it cycles right back, there's question of the value. And this slide just illustrates some figures from an article by David Siegel and colleagues, which really tries to emphasize, where marine CDR is applied, can have an influence on the permanence issue due to ocean circulation. And so this summarizes some of the points from that paper, and that typically sequestration times can be assumed to be decades to centuries, not millennia, because we know that the ocean circulates and brings water back to the surface. Deeper discharge depths are better than shallower ones. So if you get carbon down, below 1,000 meters at the onset, then you'll increase the sequestration time. And also geographic location is important. Next slide, please. And then again, another challenge is the concept of leakage. This can be looked at different ways. Again, is there something about the technique that doesn't keep carbon sequestered, that there's leakage back to the atmosphere? Or conversely, does that benefit in one area undermine carbon sequestration in other areas? And some quick examples are shown here, and a figure that came from the National Academy's report, again, looking at some of these concepts, particularly with regard to using macrophyte farming, coupled perhaps with artificial upwelling as an approach to mCDR. So I think that's it for me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Claire. Appreciate you jumping in on that. This is a slide from Matt Long that again just talks about some of the challenges with engaging in MRV, especially in the coastal ocean space. The truth is that, as you see on the right here, there is a lot of dynamic variability in the ocean system, and that can create unfavorable signal to noise ratios. So even where we have the opportunity to engage in really fine scale analytical precision, doesn't necessarily mean that we are capturing the entire net aggregate signal that we would like to be able to. Accordingly, that makes it difficult to establish a counterfactual baseline to assess additionality. We really want to be able to establish those baselines well, but that's kind of hard. We're also dealing with large spatio-temporal scales. So, CO2 equilibration happens slowly. And then there's also a large scale overturning circulation that will, again, slowly return sequestered carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So even though we may only want to measure exactly the perturbation or the intervention at the site of a carbon dioxide removal project, the truth is that intervention will have impacts over large spatiotemporal scales. Model skill and parameter uncertainty is also going to be a really big challenge. We're not necessarily adept at capturing all of these eddies that you see on the right, especially if the model is fed with data from one particular site in this kind of chaotic context. On top of that, there are a lot of unknown unknowns. We don't necessarily understand as much about how ecosystems may compensate the MRV process as we would like to. For example, what role will bacterial remineralization play? How do sediment processes and sediment remineralization maybe impact the amount of carbon dioxide that is sequestered by macrophytes, as you've talked about before, or as we've talked about before and Clare showed on a previous slide. Understanding those challenges was really the focus of a lot of the sessions of our workshop. There were 5 of them, and 4 of them really focused on identifying some of these challenges. With our breakout groups, we tried to get our attendees of the workshop to think about what good MRV looks like. Even if we can't achieve it yet, what is good MRV? Collectively, we decided that MRV is transparent. It's really built from consensus processes and aggregation of data, which means that we need a lot more data to build consensus to be able to decide what good quantification and verification looks like. We also think that good MRV provides quantitative estimates of additionality, leakage, and permanence and durability, those key challenges and issues that you heard us present already during this webinar. It also carefully considers issues of time and space, especially with regards to ecosystem impacts. The truth is that those impacts may be immediate. The impact from actually engaging in a intervention at a site may happen relatively quickly, but perhaps the benefits of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere are going to be felt in the far future. So understanding how that influences what you measure, when you measure it, and how you interact with communities can be really challenging. One of the most interesting outcomes from the workshop for me was this target diagram that you see on the right-hand side here, with the x-axis being either time or space and the y-axis being either time or space. The idea is to show that across expanding scales of time and space influences the way that we think about what to call each piece of this intervention process. So here at the center, over the smallest time and space scales, we have our CDR intervention. Perhaps just outside that, we have what we might refer to as MRV for carbon dioxide removal, trying to measure CO2 flux, for example, among some other parameters. Maybe outside of that, we need to do ecosystem monitoring over an even wider spatial and temporal scale than we are trying to do our quantification of carbon removal. And then outside of that, we need to continually assess effects of these interventions on social license and human communities. So props to the breakout groups and especially the synthesis that the breakout leaders did to come together and create this diagram, which I have used in multiple talks since then. So you want to see an outcome, this is definitely one of them. One of the key aspects that we also talked about is how does a project decide which measurements count as MRV and which don't? This really depends on the CDR pathway that you're going through. And Lennart, one of the co-chairs of our workshop, presented his thoughts on this to introduce one of our panels. And in order to decide on variables, the truth is that you need to identify the key steps, parameters, and reservoirs in your process. Essentially, MRV is as complicated as you make it. For abiotic methods, maybe you only need to assess the ocean chemistry associated with the carbon removal from the atmosphere. But if you're using phytoplankton or macrophytes in order to mediate that carbon removal from the atmosphere, that adds another reservoir and another set of steps and variables that you need to measure to actually engage in high quality MRV. And if perhaps you're using a physical process to influence the chemistry, to influence the biology, to take carbon up from the atmosphere, that introduces a whole nother set of processes that you may want to measure or that you may need to measure in order to understand exactly the relationship between, say, an artificial upwelling process and the actual carbon that is removed from the atmosphere. So again, depending upon your method, you may have different steps, parameters, and reservoirs involved in your process. another point that was made during this panel was that a secondary ecosystem or climate interactions may also affect each of these processes over here. So remineralization of carbon that is sequestered by organic life, whether that's again phytoplankton or macrophytes, may also be important to determining leakage and therefore describing the efficiency of your system. You also need to be able to resolve the baseline variability in all of those different steps, parameters, and reservoirs in your process. And this includes being able to do that without impacting essential climate time series. One of the key aspects that emerged out of the workshop is that it sure seems convenient to be able to go to, say, BATS or HOTS and use that critical, well-resolved baseline as an opportunity to establish your counterfactual right off the bat, and then, conduct your intervention at that site and say, okay, well, our baseline is already resolved. But the truth is that we need to protect those climate time series and try and conduct these early CDR sites away from them as much as we can. The truth is that we'll never be able to protect these climate time series forever. If we're successful and we do achieve gigaton scale removal, we're probably going to affect those time series simply by affecting the amount of CO2 that's stored in the atmosphere. But we sure would like to have those critical time series protected from the very beginning, which of course then makes scaling any of these interventions really challenging because you have to have a new baseline that you're establishing. In addition to deciding on your variables and how to measure those baselines associated with those variables, you have to decide on the spatial extent and duration of your project. Thinking about questions like how far away, both spatially and temporally, the removal is from your intervention, essentially going back to the target diagram that I showed on this slide. Last, the truth is that practicality is going to matter. We cannot measure everything all the time forever. We don't have access to those kinds of resources. So also when you're putting together a project, the truth is that you're going to have to think about what you can afford to measure, whether or not a model is accessible to help you fill the gap, and how any shortcuts you might take might impact your uncertainty. Overall, one of the key messages was that, yes, it's going to be very difficult to make these measurements to protect our climate time series while we're doing it. But also, there's going to be a key challenge with filling those observational gaps with models. We had multiple sessions that really focused on the key challenges that biogeochemical models face in trying to assess carbon budgets. Our workshop speakers, as well as our panels, highlighted some ways around those challenges, but there is no panacea. Models are not the silver bullet that's going to solve the MRV challenge. The truth is that next generation models need to be designed specifically for MRV or for CDR verification and prediction, that those packages are different than the ones that we have right now. And they're going to require improvements in data assimilation, explicit packages for estimation of uncertainty, as well as critical thinking of what the assumptions are that are associated with each of those models. We had a really lively panel discussion about thinking about whether or not models were ever going to be able to do the things that we needed them to do from CDR or from a CDR perspective. And there are some critical challenges ahead of us in thinking about how we use combinations of observations and models for MRV going forward. One of my personal favorite examples, because it is a personal example, is the chart that you see here on the left. This paper was recently published, finally came out on the 19th of December of this year. You can access the DOI as is shown across the bottom of the slide. But this shows a simulated ocean alkalinity enhancement intervention that's taking place in Univ Pass, and how the spread of that material through a high velocity current spreads that material out over the Bering Sea coast or shelf region, and what the associated carbon removal or estimated carbon removal associated with that intervention is. One of the key messages of the paper was that while you may have the opportunity to actually measure, carbon flux, even though it's probably going to be pretty hard right here at the site of intervention, the vast majority of carbon removed is happening at the outside edge of this plume, where you'll never be able to make measurements measured against the background for you to be able to validate this model. Should we be modeling what we cannot measure? What's the balance between those two things? Do we have an what is the optimization that is associated with a really challenging question like this? These are conversations that will be ongoing with the scientific community. So then we sort of came to, in our working groups, this idea of, okay, there's going to be a lot of challenges associated with both measuring and modeling CDR and trying to come up with these ways of quantifying and verifying these measurements. Are we ever going to be able to make headway, or can we make headway in a meaningful timescale to actually influence or help out with this industry? And thank you to those of you who are managing the chat for me. I really appreciate your help. The truth, first of all, is that a combination of observations and models is how we create the global carbon budget right now. It's not perfect, but we do use it in a decisional context. So we need to think about, the ways that we already sort of engage with this work. You'll see the global carbon budget shown in the wedges on the left, but what the bars on the right-hand side show is the amount of CDR expected by year 2050 and 2100 for being able to meet our climate goals. And so this is not necessarily what we're on track to meet, but what our targets are. So, if we feel like we can resolve the land sink or the ocean sink or the atmospheric sink for CO2, perhaps also it is not so ambitious to say that we can also resolve a total CDR sink on the global scale, albeit there will be a large amount of uncertainty associated with that. David Ho likes to point out that the assessment of those sinks between, or whether we make those assessments of the size of that sink from exclusively observations or from exclusively models, could also perhaps be the size of this bar. So what actually do we have the capacity to measure? I think one of the messages here for the scientific community is that we need to get better at making assessments of the global carbon budget as well. So there's an argument for continuing the kind of basic foundational work that we already do at the scientific community. New technology may also make all the difference. We're getting better at making measurements all the time. We're making more and more measurements all the time. Certainly that's true from those of us or those in the community that have supported the development of the Biogeochemical Argo program. The sensors that were developed as a part of the Wendy Schmidt Ocean Health X Prize, as well as the advent of new platforms carrying our standard sensors like the sail drone. However, I want to emphasize that technology development must also include investments in exascale computing. Our climate models have to get better if we're going to be able to also articulate improvements, in things like our carbon budget. They use combinations of observations and models for decisional support. So our key tasks include things like improving our observing systems and developing new sensing technology. ARPA-E, you may have heard, has a new call coming out focused specifically on those kinds of challenges, but also investments in exascale computing. Another key message that came out of the workshop is that everybody wants field trials. We know that early studies, maybe model studies like the one I already showed, can be smaller, but the truth is that eventually we're going to need something like the scale of exports or roses, or mosaic that the scientific community is already engaging in right now. We need large long-term programs that require large long-term investments, even if we're just talking about the kitchen sink. But then also we want to be able to measure as much of what we can as a part of a permanent underpinning observing system for the global oceans. So how do our early studies inform the design of our field trials that maybe then help us say, okay, well, what can we measure that would be valuable as part of a permanent observing system? Traditionally, we see things like these early studies supported by NSF, maybe the National Oceanographic Partnerships Program, basic research, right? When we move into these field trials and thinking about the scale of field trials and exports, that's really programs that are sponsored by NSF and NASA. And then thinking about our observational systems, those are really underpinned by NOAA with contributions from NSF as well as NASA. So funders, if you're listening, this is what your proposers think is your responsibility. Not to put you on the hook for agreeing with this, but these were the outcomes that we heard from the workshop. Possibly the most consistent message we heard in all of the breakout rooms, no matter what topic we were talking about, aspirational or not aspirational, is holy crap, we do not have enough people to be able to do this. Recruitment and training is going to be one of the #1 things that this industry and this community needs. We need the capacity to get a lot more graduate students involved. And quite frankly, this is a call to all of you on the line. If you're not already studying carbon removal, boy, we sure could use your help. Every perspective, as you see with the multiple jobs in this cartoon listed here, is going to be essential for really understanding not just quantification and verification of carbon removal, but ecosystem impacts, socioeconomic issues, and social license, creating decision support products, etc. We need the full spectrum of scientific research involved with this field. We also need to be co-designing these projects with local interests and getting communities involved. So even though you may not be a professional researcher or scientist, whether you fall on the natural or the social sciences end of the spectrum, whether you're a chemist or a biologist or a physicist, the truth is that you need local communities involved with this process as well. And we also had a session that was dedicated to understanding and educating the science community on how to engage with local communities as a part of this process. I'm including a quote here in the upper left from Anu Khan from Carbon 180, who actually spoke as a part of our workshop. And her argument was that if MRV enables accountability, there are justice considerations embedded in the development and implementation of MRV tools and protocols. One of my favorite breakout sessions was one that we held that was talking about all of these justice principles that Anu suggested might be included under MRV, thinking about the risks that are associated with each of these MRV principles and what actions we might be able to take to limit those risks. Hats off to the breakout groups virtually. You guys did a great job. But overall, I wanted to offer a summary. Of this session, and the truth is that we need to train the community to collect data, design our projects, and manage the implementation of those projects to create assessments of who benefits from CDR activities, to engage the public in maintaining consent for conducting field trials, perhaps right in their backyard. We also need to be producing data and research that helps establish safeguards and understand socioeconomic consequences for communities of engaging in this work. And we need to be able to do that across spatial and temporal scales. So not necessarily thinking about the immediate risks that come from a particular intervention at one particular site and how it might impact the community, but also thinking about downstream impacts of maybe away from the site of that intervention, as well as the intergenerational justice of removing carbon from the atmosphere. All of those issues are a part of the conversation and should inform how we're engaging, especially with these larger scale projects. But it's better and easier if you get started working with communities directly on the smaller scale projects from the very beginning and co-developing what those management processes look like. There are a number of emerging ideas that are coming forth after the end of this workshop. Can carbon removal help reverse ocean acidification? I provided a brief cascade of research sort of in order from how it was published and sort of what we started with to kind of what some of the open questions are at the bottom there now. We started out by thinking that, hey, we probably can't reverse ocean acidification without also engaging in steep parallel emissions reductions, and that's probably still true. But maybe there are some contexts in which we could pause if we can't reverse existing acidification of the surface oceans, unless perhaps we use some of these carbon removal methods to remove carbon from subsurface areas that may be really struggling with ocean acidification impacts, which necessarily is at odds from surface carbon removal, which would allow the surface ocean to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, sort of pitting ocean acidification mitigation against actual carbon removal from the atmosphere. And then, some of these open concepts right now that is it possible to do some of these things at the same time? If you're going to have an ocean alkalinity enhancement intervention, could you maybe remove carbon from the atmosphere and then use the exact same infrastructure to try and mitigate ocean acidification consequences in the subsurface at the same time? Maybe there's opportunities for sort of dual use of that infrastructure. Pat, I wanted to turn it over to you to talk about this emerging issue.
Okay, thanks, Jess. So, one of the regular conversations we had during the workshop, well, I should say before, during, and after the workshop is MRV is going to be difficult. But at least one of the emerging ideas from this workshop was that, perhaps we can reduce some of this uncertainty in MRV with additional measurements. And so this kind of leads to two thoughts on the matter. One, what measurements are we going to make? So as Lennart, we quoted Lennart earlier saying, what can we afford to measure? And he had a series of criteria to look at, to consider when thinking about what measurements to make. But, we actually have to, we really need to strongly consider that. And so there's a picture here of just of the whiteboard during one of our breakout rooms. And we just went through and said, okay, what about this? Okay, well, for nutrient fertilization, we want this and that. And speaking of which, one of the ideas or one of the parameters that has been put forward by some people, including myself, is that we should be considering some isotope measurements. Carbon isotopes might be useful for additionality, for identifying additionality. For nutrient fertilization, I can think of carbon isotopes also being useful there, nitrogen isotopes, iron isotopes, a variety of measurements. These are, more of the, I guess you would consider these less common parameters, but, and yet they are regular commonplace measurements for some of us, including the isotope geochemists in the group. So this got summarized in our breakout group as, so how are we going to measure this long list? And I'm sure some of us here could work and make this list much longer. And so this got the strategy behind, figuring out what to measure and then pairing those back to what is essential for verifying that CO2 was taken up. We shortened this to ramp up, then ramp down. And so I want to cite Adam Subash for that nice little pithy take on this way to determine what observations we should make, and then ramp it down. Okay, so I'll jump back. I'll send it back to you, Jess. Thanks for the time.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. Again, like there were such active conversations happening in the breakout rooms. It's always really useful to think back like, oh, that really spawned this whole new pathway or this whole new rabbit hole I'm down for the last, couple of months or the last quarter. We've talked about, kind of the educational foundations of the workshop, really coming together on shared definitions of what MRV is, what the challenges associated with that are, thinking through how we might be able to get better. What are the emerging issues that are sort of coming to us after the conclusion of our workshop? One of the things that your scientific steering committee is working on right now is developing a workshop report. I believe we are on our 4th submission of this workshop report at this point. So many thanks to Jaime Palter for spearheading this and to the rest of the team for contributing to the text. Right now we're targeting AUS as an opportunity for us to be able to publish. And here's kind of the outline that we think we might be putting together. I'll sort of leave this up as an opportunity for you to think through it. But we really want to be able to build a case for why CDR is needed, offer a couple of examples, some concrete recommendations, and then, moving from there, what are the next actionable steps we might be able to take? So if you screenshot this slide and, are thinking about what you'd actually like to see come out of a workshop report, please email us. We'd like to know what your thoughts and opportunities are. Another one of the key workshop outcomes that we wanted was to think about what we're going to do with a working group. And the person who's really been kind of taking leadership in those ideas on the steering committee team is Jaime Palter. And so Jaime, I wanted to turn over this discussion to you. Oh no, apparently we've lost Jaime. So I'm so sorry, Jamie, that we didn't finish this up in time for you to still be able to
Actually,
engage.
I think, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. So I knew I might have technical difficulties. I'm joining via phone for my voice and video. It's a workaround for my situation. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about what was really a brainstorm with Jessica about building out a working group. And it came from, I would call it a practice of the not this, not that practice, where we would put up an idea and swat it down, because there is a proliferation of activities in CDR and MRV happening all over the place. Webinars, best practice documents and groups writing them, methods-based groups. And we just were like looking at what we could do that's new and unique to OCB. And so I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that Heather, May, and Mary run an incredible operation that builds community with the scientists. I spent 3 years on the scientific steering committee of OCB, and what I loved about it was this sense of working together. And I think that really came through in the workshop in a way that if you were lucky enough to attend, if I do say myself, you got a sense of a shared vision of a community-minded push to do this well. And so we were thinking about how can we continue that community building and through the working group. And so there are a number of virtual communities, like the Air Miners have this webinar series, which is excellent. XOIS is meeting virtually, and it does great work. They're focused sometimes on single CDR approaches, sometimes centered on commercialization or governance. So, and they're often lacking that in-person dynamic and the scientific expertise that OCB targets. And then on top of it, following the isolation of the pandemic, where we were so reduced in our interconnectedness, we thought it could be a good time to build up that sense of interconnectedness. So with all of that as background, if you click to the next slide, I hope. We thought about spawning regional nodes as the working group activity. So the idea would be that the working group leaders, so probably the people that already led the workshop, plus a set of at least an equal number of working group leaders, would work to spawn a regional node, which would meet just once in an organized way through OCB. This is again a brainstorm, but and I'm privileged to brainstorm with almost 100 of you together now. But that regional node would meet that first time in an organized fashion, let's say for pizza, or the leader would reserve the back room of a Thai restaurant or something, to discuss targeted questions, provide a networking opportunity, bring in our early career scientists, and a key thing that Heather's pointed out is to bring in other stakeholders, non-academic stakeholders. The topic could be chosen by the regional node leader in consultation with the other working group leaders, and would manage the place to meet up all of those kind of organizational details. Then there would be some kind of registration. The registered stakeholders would meet in person to discuss a targeted question, network and share ideas. A note taker in coordination with the group leader would write up key results and archive them in an open access online archive that models the best practices of open science. And so there's a QR code there, which just aims to see if people would do this. Would you go to one of these regional nodes? Does that sound interesting? How far would you drive? Would you want to have broad scale brainstorming? What is good MRV? Or would you want to dig way into the dirty details of fertilization of calcifiers when you deploy ocean alkalinity enhancement? And does this, I think it's just a general, and are there other thoughts you'd like to share about this idea for a working group model, which is new as far as I know? And so I hope that you'll take a minute, scan that QR code, and answer that poll, because you now, the 96 of you, could help shape how that working group looks. So I really appreciate that. And that's all I had to say. Thanks for bearing with my technical problems.
If you don't want to scan the QR code, the link is also in the chat. We really hope you'll share your thoughts with us about whether or not this is something you want or like, or, you know, just maybe it's something you hate. There's a field in there for you to be able to tell us whatever it is that you'd like to share in response to this idea. We want to hear from you. We want to make sure that this working group is serving our OCB community. So please take a moment, 3-minute survey to just share your thoughts with us. We were also asked after we announced this webinar to provide multiple notices to the community about stuff that is going on. A quick synopsis of all of that is here. You may have seen that XOIS had their white paper come out. I've advertised the draft CDR strategy for NOAA and held some listening sessions. There's a $30 million NOP NOFO that has hit the books. Tomorrow is the industry day for potentially for an opening FOA from ARPA-E. That's the sensor development thing that we talked about. Compass has announced trainings for how to talk about marine CDR. NACP is hosting the follow-on MRV workshop that we hope will take lessons learned from our workshop going forward. Ocean Visions is also having its biennial summit coming up in April. And then you may also have seen that there is a document called the stateofcdr.org and a big report that was just released as well. So we tried to copy all of the links for you to be able to type them in here. I know that there's an abundance of folks that really wish that they had just hyperlinks here. We are going to share the slides and recording for this webinar, so you'll be able to click forward on some of them. One thing that I would like to emphasize is that, like Jaime talked about on the last slide, part of the reason that we sort of settled on this idea for the working groups is that there are proliferating a number of communities of practice that are coming out there. And so you may want to consider some of the offerings from the Ocean Visions programs, from Open Air, which I think at this point has 59 episodes on CDR relevant topics, including some marine CDR topics. Air Miners, the next Air Miners event is actually focused on providing insurance for carbon removal products. So if you are interested in decision, how we make decision support data products for the CDR community, maybe thinking about insurance is something that we want to understand a little bit more about. Columbia and Northwestern together, I believe, also have a webinar series called Scrubbing the Skies, which focuses a little bit on kind of the legal and governance aspects. And then if you really want to get involved with the climate tech community, I encourage you to engage with the Verge programs that are hosted by GreenBiz as well. And again, we'll provide some of these links with the recording of this webinar. That kind of rounds out the conversation for us. You may be interested in contrasting views of what we thought right after the workshop ended. These were the most important messages for the scientific community that really shook out. Again, get ready to build capacity. There's a role for basic research here. MRV is difficult, but it's going to improve over time with effort, and transparency is going to be central to this process and really developing consensus with some of these messages. And then, the most important messages for funders is that we need to emphasize, support for co-development from the very beginning, as well as public-private partnerships, enabling us to maybe get out of a basic research perspective that just focuses on the academic community, but enables us to work directly with private companies. We also need to understand that timescales for the intervention of a CDR method, as well as the MRV, may be mismatched. And accordingly, that means we need longer term grants and, protecting those climate time series, but also establishing baselines. And then as well, you know, international collaborations may be essential, especially for working in the open ocean. All of this means that we need a massive investment in CDR work going forward if we're going to meet some of the challenges that are in front of us. So at this point, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'll open the conversation for all of you. And ask if you have any questions or feedback on the working group or thoughts about the workshop that you want to share. This is your time. I see some folks dropping links into the chat for me. You're very kind. Any questions? You're welcome to unmute yourselves and just jump in. My goodness, have I stunned you all into silence?
This is Lori Z here. I am just curious. Thank you so much for all this. It's wonderful. I appreciate the momentum going forward. If anyone has a job ad they've written for a faculty member to come into this area, can you please share it? Because I've been encouraged to write such a job ad for my unit. And so that's in thinking about the workforce development aspect of things.
Outstanding. So happy to hear that. Which institution, if you don't mind me asking?
A university, South Carolina.
Lori, OCB is constantly posting job ads, and I know I've seen a few come across my desk about CDR. So I encourage you to check the jobs site on the OCB website and see if there are any in there that you could leverage.
Link just popped up in the chat. Pat, Jamie, Claire, did I miss anything? Last minute, please, for engagement.
Does anybody want to suggest? Does anybody want to suggest some regional themes or to follow up on Jamie's structure?
Volunteer to lead a node. Well, we look forward to hearing from you at that quick survey.
We'll be reading those responses.
All right. Heather, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Looks like Chris Pierce has his hand raised. Why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hi all. It's just on that regional node aspect. Were you thinking within the US or is this international? Because it's going to be quite hard to cross the pond to come over, but very happy to sort of support this from a UK perspective. There's probably quite a few of us on the call, something we're certainly looking to get engaged with, and obviously across Europe as well. So.
Lennart isn't here to speak for himself, but we were hopeful that in addition to some of these regional nodes with getting back to meeting in person and building that community, we acknowledged that there was going to be far-flung interest in this idea and maybe getting some virtual communities sprung up as well would be a part of this. That being said, a virtual meeting is easy to schedule and doesn't necessarily require financial support the same way that like having a pizza party would. So there'd be a little bit of a differential there. Anything that received US or that received OCB support would have to be in the US. Is that correct, Heather? If you got money from the project office, I see a nod, but that doesn't mean that we're not willing to support some regional community building as well. After all, one of our members is in Australia, or one of our steering team members is in Australia, so.
All right, thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for an amazing presentation that stunned everybody to silence. I think you covered everything really well, and it really highlighted the key outcomes of all of the great discussions we had at the workshop. I just want to end with a serious call to arms here. The OCB community just has the expertise across ocean science to come to the table and address this challenge. And it's going to take working across not just our communities, but this stakeholder engagement to solve the problem. And so whatever we can do to facilitate not just the scientific interaction focused on the ocean carbon cycle, but also the interaction with the stakeholders we need at the table to solve this problem. We really want your ideas on how to do that. And this working group is step one. So please take the survey, and thank you so much for joining today. The recording and this link to the slides, a view-only link to Jessica's slides, will be made available on the workshop website, and then we will reach out and let you know when that is ready. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Shout out to the OCB team. Thanks for getting us organized and ready for this webinar.